Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be included in this Inside Out Summit, this leadership summit. I understand that I'm speaking to the people who are really trying to make the movement grow even more vibrant. So I will share my screen. I have some slides that will start a conversation, I'm hoping, among us. And hold on. So I entitled my remarks this morning, Dismantling Racism in the Children and Nature Movement, Naming Racism and Moving to Action. It's interesting that as a family physician and epidemiologist who's been doing this work for decades, all of a sudden, first with the advent of COVID-19 and then with the murder of George Floyd and then all of the other murders that we're learning about before and after, and people's willingness to acknowledge that racism exists, I've been called on a lot. And now the 4 key messages, if you don't get anything else from what I say in the next several minutes, the 4 key messages that I hope you'll take home are that racism exists, that racism is a system, that racism saps the strength of the whole society, and that we can act to dismantle racism. So what I aim to do right now is to share some tools so that you can really understand these things. And the first tool is one of my allegories that I use when I'm talking about issues of racism that's been based on something that happened in my own real life. So the moral of this allegory, which I call Dual Reality, a Restaurant Saga, is that racism exists. That's the first of the key messages. And so let me tell you the story. Let me tell you what happened to me. So as a first-year medical student, I was, of course, very studious, very diligent. So here it is one Saturday morning, and I wake up early, and what do? I hit the books, hit them hard, studying, deeply into the afternoon, and then some friends come over. So what do? Well, they don't distract me. We all start hitting the books long and hard, and now it's getting late. And we're getting hungry, and I have no food in the apartment, which was quite typical of me. So my friends were understanding. They said, okay, Camara, never mind. Let's go into town and find something to eat. So that's what we do. We go into town and we find a restaurant and we walk in and we sit down and the menus are presented and we order our food and the food is served. And here we are eating. So now I've confused a few of you. You're like, that's not a very illuminating story about racism. Well, no, not yet. But as I sat there with my friends eating, I looked across the room and I noticed a sign that was a startling revelation to me about racism. So now I've intrigued you and you're like, Dr. Jones, what did the sign say? Well, what did the sign say? The sign said, open. So now maybe I've lost some of you. So let me recap. Here we are sitting in a restaurant eating. I look across the room. I notice a sign that says open. And thinking no more about it, I would have assumed that other hungry people could walk in, sit down, order their food and eat. After all, that was my experience. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I recognized that now indeed the restaurant was closed due to the hour, but firmly closed, and that other hungry people just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of that sign, would not be able to come in, sit down, order their food and eat. And that's when I recognized that racism structures open, closed signs in our society. That racism structures, if you will, a dual reality. And for those who are sitting inside the restaurant at the table of opportunity eating, and they look up and they see a sign that says open, they don't even recognize that there's a two-sided sign going on because it is difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. So, for example, it's difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It's difficult for white Americans to recognize white privilege and racism. In fact, it's difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context. But those on the outside are very well aware that there's a two-sided sign going on because it proclaims closed to them, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. So back inside the restaurant, to those who ask, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I say, I know it's hard for you to know when you only see open. In fact, that's part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to name racism. It's actually an empowering thing. It doesn't even compel you to act, but it does equip you to act so that if you care about those on the other side of the sign, which is an if, why, you could even talk to the restaurant owner who is, after all, inside with you. And you could say, restaurant owner, there are hungry people outside. Why don't you open the door, let them come in? You will make more money and oh, the conversations we could have. Or maybe what you'll do is pass food through the window, or maybe you'll try to tear down that sign or break through that door. But at least what you won't do is be sitting back saying, wonder why those people don't just come on in and sit down and eat. Because you'll understand something about the two-sided nature of that sign. So I tell this story when I have 4 minutes to talk to a group of people and convey to them that yes, racism exists. It's creating a two-sided or multi-sided sign. It's creating a dual or multifaceted reality. And honestly, I have to tell you that once with this single question, how could people who are born inside the restaurant know something about the two-sided nature of that sign? I actually started a 3-hour conversation because there are many, many ways to know. And I would be interested, I'm not going to use 3 hours of my little 30 minutes or 45 minutes that I have right now, but I will allude to some of those ways. But what I am thankful for right now is that at this point in our nation's history, in the past 6 or 7 months, there are more people who were born inside the restaurant who got some kind of glimpse of the other side of that sign. Maybe the air conditioning went on higher. As one of my friends said, maybe a brick came through the window and caused a breeze, but there are more people recognizing that there is a two-sided sign going on. And so they are affirming, for example, that Black Lives Matter, or talking about structural racism or systemic racism. This is very heartening, I would have to say, because that's the first step. Naming is the first step, but I also have to give a warning that if all we do as individuals is put those words together and start talking about structural or systemic racism, or as organizations put out a statement, the baseline positioning of this nation in staunch racism denial is so seductive that if all we do is say a thing, then in 6 months, we may forget why we said that thing and fall back into what I'm now describing as the sleepiness or somnolence of racism denial. So we must go beyond saying words to acting. And when we act, we have to tear down the sign. But of course, racism is not just the sign, it's the door, it's the lock. So we have to dismantle the lock. We need to take the door off the hinges. And I tell you, if we go beyond saying a thing to acting, we will not forget why we were acting. But I owe you all now a definition of racism, now that I've given you this story that I hope you'll remember and share with somebody in your family or in your social network group or somebody. What do I mean when I say that word racism? And I am clear that when I say racism, I'm talking about a system. So I'm not talking about an individual character flaw or a personal moral failing or even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested. And certainly racism can manifest in those ways, but in its essence, racism is a system of power. And a system of doing what? Well, a system of doing two things, of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And on what basis is that opportunity structured, and on what basis is the value assigned? It's based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race. I used to give an hour-long lecture on race. So if somebody wants to ask me more about race, then you ask me in a Q&A. But just clearly that race is not biology, right? We've mapped the human genome. There's no basis for human subspeciation, by anything. called race or anything. It's not culture. It's not even social class, although it's related to social class because of structural racism. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what it is the social interpretation of how one looks in this race-conscious society that acts as the substrate on which the system, racism, operates both historically and today to differentially structure opportunity and assign value. And this system has three impacts. Now, most of you all will be able to help me out right now with the first impact, which is that racism unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, because when we talk about racism, that's usually where we go. But it shouldn't take us long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage, so that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. And that's the whole issue of unearned white privilege that we hardly ever talk about in this country, because it makes some people, especially some people who are living as white, uncomfortable. And I used to apologize, when I got to this point in my slides or in my talks, I'd say, well, I know I may have made some of you uncomfortable just now by talking about how racism unfairly advantages other individuals and communities, or unearned white privilege. And I used to say, just shake it off, stay with me, I'll tell you some more stories. But I do not apologize like that anymore. In fact, I say, if you feel uncomfortable, I would suggest that you lean into that discomfort, because I have come to learn that for all of us, the edge of our comfort is our growing edge. But there's a third impact of racism that many of us don't recognize, and that is that racism saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. So it's not that, for example, Black Lives Matter. It's that Black lives are precious, and Black lives are genius, and Black lives are leadership, and Black lives are, creativity and generosity and love and all of these things. And when we constrain Black lives and Indigenous lives and Latinx lives and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific and Islander lives and Asian lives and all of these racialized lives, when we constrain these lives slowly by not vigorously investing in the full, excellent public education of all of our children, because the blinders of racism have made some people feel like, there's no genius in the barrios or the ghettos or on the reservations. We can get along very well, thank you, without those kids. Or when we constrain those lives slowly by being complacent with the disproportionate incarceration of so many Black and brown men, in our prison systems, or whether we constrain that life or snap it out in a minute with a police officer's bullet or a police officer's knee. In all of those ways, it's not just a problem for the individual or the family or even the community that's directly impacted. This is sapping the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. Before I leave this slide, I just want to say one more thing. I know that there are many people in this country. I know this because I experienced something that made me have this insight when I was at CDC. There are many people in this country who think that there are two states of being, that yes, there's disadvantage, and then the other state is normal. And the reason that so many people in this country think that there are two states of being, which are disadvantaged and normal, is that we are ahistorical. And people do not understand that their so-called normal is built up on a whole mountain of unfair advantage. I really appreciated the land acknowledgement at the beginning. That's one way for people to understand the importance of history, the existence of history, to become aware of the history and then understand what it means. But now I'm going to shift gears for just a minute. Again, I've given you now some tools for understanding that racism exists and that it's a system and that it saps the strength of the whole society. So maybe I've already ticked off 3 of the 4 main messages that I wanted to share with you. But I also wanted to share now a framework for understanding how does racism turn into health outcomes, because as a family physician and epidemiologist, my day-to-day is about health. Or how does it turn into educational outcomes, or housing outcomes, or exposure to nature outcomes, all of these things. And so I distilled 3 levels of racism: institutionalized, or what today we call structural. So this paper and this work, the paper was published 20 years ago. I've been doing this work for 30 years. So institutionalized or structural racism, personally mediated, or what some people call interpersonal racism. But even though personally mediated is quite a little tongue twister, I still insist on calling this level of racism personally mediated racism, because I know that racism is a system that's mediated through people. It is not something that originates, I would say, in the people. And internalized. So I'm going to very briefly define each of these levels of racism, illustrate how they can impact health and other outcomes, and then illustrate them with my Gardener's Tale allegory, another one of my stories. So, institutionalized racism is the system, if you will. It's the constellation of structures and policies and practices and norms and values, all of this stuff taken together that results in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. This is the kind of racism that does not require an identifiable perpetrator because it's been institutionalized in our laws and customs and background norms. This is the kind of racism that results in, at birth, I'm trying to think of inherited. It results in inherited disadvantage, or its reciprocal inherited advantage. We see it both in terms of material conditions as well as in terms of access to power. So examples include differential access by race to quality housing, or excellent educational opportunities, or equal employment opportunities, or even the same level of income at the same level of employment. Differential access to green space, differential access to just knowing about the importance of green space. Differential access to medical facilities, including linguistic access or financial access or proximity access, differential access to a clean environment, and the very well-documented disproportionate placement of toxic dump sites and bus transfer stations and the like in communities of color. So all of those are in terms of material conditions, but even in terms of access to power, differential access to information, including information about our own histories, differential access to resources, so not just social networking resources, but material resources and nature resources and the like, differential access to voice in government, voice in media. And sometimes when people see this slide, I might get a question right there, and they say, Dr. Jones, excuse me, but would you look at your top set of examples, housing, education, employment, income? Dr. Jones, isn't that what we call social class? Why do you have that on a slide about racism? Are you talking about racism, or are you really, really, really talking about social class? That is such an important question that I want to delve a little deeply into that before I go on to my next slides. To say, first of all, that it doesn't just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty, while white people in this country are overrepresented in wealth. That is not just a happenstance. And for each marginalized or stigmatized or oppressed group of color, there's been some initial historical injustice. So for example, for American Indians, it was the taking of the land and the near genocide, and then the moving of survivors to reserved lands, reservations, and then in some instances, something good was found under one reservation. Oops, you got to pick the people up and move them somewhere else. There are people, for example, who lived for centuries in Mexico, never crossed the border, but the border crossed them. And now they find themselves in New Mexico and Arizona and the like, and the great-great-grandchildren are still being harassed and still being persecuted and killed. And it's now been more than a year, the El Paso massacre. There are, we have a very odd relationship to migrant labor starting really with the forced migration of Africans, but I'm going to come to that in a minute. But even the importation, if you will, of Chinese laborers to build our railroads when they were unable by law to bring their families and unable by law to marry. We saw examples of differential treatment as recently, I would say, it's as the internment during World War II of Japanese Americans without the internment of German Americans or Italian Americans, and getting to the, what happened to people of West African ancestry. That initial historical injustice was the kidnapping of West African people, our importation across the Atlantic with tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage, and then for the survivors and their progeny for generations, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. But then people hear me talking like that and they're like, oh, Dr. Jones, there you go talking about slavery. Dr. Jones, we all recognize that slavery was an unfortunate chapter in our nation's history. But Dr. Jones, the enslaved people were emancipated in 1865, and we are now in 2020. So that makes that 155 years ago. Dr. Jones, all else being equal, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? But of course, the answer to that question is in the question, all else being equal. And all else has not been equal since 1865. And all else still is not equal today. And there are what I describe as present day contemporary structural factors that perpetuate that and each of those other initial historical injustices. And these contemporary structural factors are part and parcel of institutionalized or structural racism. So when I am asked, am I talking about racism or am I really talking about social class? My response is that structural or institutionalized racism explains why we even see an association between social class and race in this country. This is a very important aha, which is not to diminish the importance of addressing poverty. I am all in for addressing poverty. Give me that work, give me that magic wand, whatever you want to do, boom, poverty gone. Going beyond that, income equalized, right? But even if I had that power today, if I were to equalize income in this country today without recognizing and addressing the background structures and policies and practices and norms and values of structural or institutionalized racism, if I were to do that today without addressing those mechanisms of structural racism, then in one generation, we would start to see a stratification by race again in terms of income. This is not an either or proposition, it is a both and. And before I leave this slide, just one more thing. We must understand that structural racism can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission, and very often, institutionalized or structural racism shows up as lack of action, inaction in the face of need. The second level of racism, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential assumptions based on those, differential actions based on those assumptions. So this is what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the different idea, the prejudice, and the different action, the discrimination. Many ways that this can impact health, including police brutality. And, you know, I'm just going to say the first 10 names that come to my mind right now in terms of that. So George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, Ahmaud Arbery. Well, no, that was a self-appointed, police protector of the neighborhood. Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Laquan McDonald, on and on and on. And Sandra Bland, we need to hear and remember these names. And as I said, it's not just the one loss of life of genius and opportunity and potential, or the families who have been forever fractured, or the communities who are just bracing themselves for the next occurrence. Because for the most part, we've had little accountability by police departments for these actions. It's the whole society that is being hurt by these actions. Physician disrespect can be as subtle as a physician not giving a patient the full range of treatment options because the physician figures that patient wouldn't understand or wouldn't comply, or couldn't afford, or it could be quite blatant, which is like sterilization abuse in our nation's history. And then even again right now, as you start to hear the stories of hysterectomies on ICE detainees in Georgia. Shopkeeper vigilance being followed around in stores, or waiter indifference, not getting quick, respectful treatment, or even being accosted in Central Park while you're bird watching, being threatened because you ask somebody to put their dog on a leash, which is the rule. So all of these things are what people describe as everyday racism, the microaggressions, the subtle communication of disrespect that certainly has been connected to elevated blood pressures in communities of color, blood pressures that don't even go down at night. Teacher devaluation. When a teacher looks at a young child and thinks that that child can't learn, and therefore puts that child off in the attention deficit disorder track, where that child will never even know their full potential, much less have the opportunity to develop to their full potential. This level of racism, personally mediated racism, like institutionalized, can be through acts of doing as well as acts of not doing. But even more important is to recognize that personally mediated racism can be unintentional as well as intentional. You do not have to have intended to do something racist to have had a racist impact. The third level of racism, internalized racism, I'm defining here from the point of view of members of stigmatized races as acceptance by members of stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. I do recognize that the internalized sense of entitlement that many people who are living as white in this country have, that is also internalized racism, but it's not on my slide because I really I'm just starting to try to figure out how could internalized racism turn into bad health outcomes. And now I'm getting an inkling that maybe it's internalized racism, a sense of, a sense of entitlement, on the white side of things, that sense of entitlement, if you have a sense of entitlement toward it, maybe that's related to what people are describing as the diseases of despair in white populations, the suicides and the like. But here I'm thinking about internalized racism from the point of view of members of stigmatized races, where it shows up as self-devaluation, feeling maybe I'm really not as good as, maybe I shouldn't try to graduate from high school or apply to that college or live in that neighborhood or try to get that job. The white man's ice is colder syndrome, that phraseology I learned from my parents in their generation. What it meant in that generation, and still means for many people of color today, is say that you are Black, for example, like me, and you need a lawyer, you might well seek out a white lawyer over a Black lawyer. Or if you were sick, you might prefer the white doctor over the Black doctor if you could find a Black doctor, right? Or if your lemonade were warm, you might go way down the street to get the white man's ice over the Black man's ice, deeply believing that the white man's ice is colder, deeply internalizing the myth of white superiority. It turns into resignation, helplessness, hopelessness, which turns into a lot of self-destructive health behaviors, turns into not registering to vote sometimes, or not voting even if you are registered. And there, people, I'm just going to say this right now, there's so many assaults on the rights of citizens in this nation to exercise their citizenship right to vote right now that we cannot sit by. We cannot sit by. But anyway, let me get back to internalized racism, which is really about accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. So I often say an example of that is when you hear young high school students of color, where one of them is trying to be the valedictorian of the school and the others are teasing her or him, saying, well, so-and-so is just trying to be white. But it's also accepting the limitations to our full humanity of, Black folks don't play the violin, or Black folks don't go camping, or Black folks don't, grow gardens, or whatever the communication has been from outside that limits us in our own full humanity. So I'm going to illustrate these three levels of racism with my Gardener's Tale allegory. And because I'm going to use my hands a lot, I'm actually going to stop sharing briefly so that if you put me in speaker view, will be big for you. And I'm going to tell you a story to not only illustrate the relationship between these three levels of racism, but to also suggest what we need to do if we want to set things right. This story was also sparked by something that happened in my own real life. So let me tell you what happened first, and then we'll make it a story about racism. My husband and I had been married about a year, moved back down to Baltimore. I was going to finish my PhD at Hopkins, and we bought our first freestanding house. Cute little house, big wraparound porch with flower boxes dotted all on the porch. And when we bought this house in October, we recognized that's not really the time to plant in Baltimore. But when spring came, my husband, who loves to garden, ran out with our marigold seeds, going to decorate our cute little house. And then he ran right back in. And he said, Camara, some of these flower boxes have dirt in them, but some of these boxes are empty. So I need to go to the gardening store. So he does. And he comes back hauling big old bags of potting soil, right? And then we fill up the empty boxes. Then we take equal numbers of our marigold seeds and plant them in all the boxes, and we water all of the boxes equally. And then by this time, because I am not the gardener in the family, now I'm exhausted. And I figure I'm just going to sit back and be delighted. Well, about 3 weeks later, as I'm walking out of my front door and, finally paying attention to these flower boxes on my porch, what I saw made me literally stop in my tracks, because what I saw made me think that we had planted completely different species in some boxes versus the others. Because some of the boxes were full of plants, and they were tall, vigorous looking plants. And other boxes just had a few plants in them, and they were kind of scrawny and scraggly looking. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil that we had brought turned out to be rich, fertile soil. So all of the seed planted in the rich, fertile soil had sprouted. The strong seed had grown very tall and vigorous, but even the weak seed had made it halfway up. But that old soil that we found there turned out to be poor, rocky soil. So the weak seed planted in the poor, rocky soil just died. And even the strong seed in that poor, rocky soil had to struggle to make it to a middling height. And maybe some of you guys, I bet all of you guys are nodding your heads because you're into nature. Maybe you garden, maybe you've seen this with your own real eyes. The image that I have painted is about the importance of the soil, the importance of the environment. But now I'm going to take that image and I'm going to make this a story about racism by introducing a gardener. So now we're going to have a gardener who has two flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed produces pink blossoms and some of the seed produces red blossoms. And this gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed, she puts it in the rich, fertile soil, pink seed in the poor, rocky soil. 3 weeks later, she sees in her flower boxes what I saw in mine. In that rich, fertile soil, all the red seed sprouts, strong red seed grows tall and vigorous. The weak red seed makes it halfway up. In that poor rocky soil, the weak pink seed dies. Here comes the strong pink seed, struggling to make it to a middling height. And then in those flower boxes, those flowers go to seed. And then the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year after year after year, the same thing happens till finally about 10 years later, the gardener's looking at her flower boxes and she says, I was right to prefer red over pink. So we're going to interrupt the story there to say the first part of this story is how institutionalized or structural racism works, where you had the initial historical injustice of the separation of the seed into the two types of soil. You had the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate, and then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But let's pick the story back up to say, well, where is personally mediated racism in the garden? Well, the gardener's looking over at the red flowers and thinking, oh, those red flowers are so beautiful. And then she looks at the pink flowers and she says, ooh, those pink flowers sure are scrawny and scraggly. So she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or maybe she notices that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil. So she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that goes on. And where would internalized racism be in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just enjoying being red. Many of them not acknowledging or maybe not even understanding that they're benefiting from enriched soil. So the red flowers are just enjoying that. The pink flowers are looking over at red, thinking that red is mighty fine and wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees. And the bees are just minding their own business, pollinating, but collecting nectar and pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee, into one of the pink flowers, and then to another pink flower, and to this pink flower. This flower's like, get away from me, bee. Don't bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red, because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, we could start by addressing the internalized racism. So we could go over to the pink flowers and we could say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink. That is an important intervention. But if that's all we do, it's not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. So you say, oh, okay, well, maybe let's address the personally mediated racism. Let's have a conversation with the gardener, or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener. So we do. And in the workshop, we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will, and maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's still not going to change the situation in which those pink flowers find themselves. If we really want to set things right in this garden, we must address the structural racism, which means we have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if you want to keep separate boxes, that's all right too, although it makes it easier for that same gardener to continue segregating resources going forward. But if you do want to keep separate boxes, it means you must enrich that poor rocky soil until it is as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when you do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious, so that in that intervention on the structural racism, you will have also addressed the internalized racism, because pink will no longer be looking over at red, thinking red is better or wanting to be red. And in that intervention on the structural racism, you may also address the personally mediated racism. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children who grow up and see the flowers equally beautiful will be less likely to have that kind of attitude. So this story has been to illustrate these three levels of racism and to strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in the garden, we must at least address the structural racism. And if we do, the other levels may take care of themselves. But there's one more question, and because of how Zoom is, I have to kind of start all the way here. There's one more question that we really need to answer, which is, who is the gardener? After all, the gardener is the one that I gave the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources, which are actually the different elements of self-determination. So who is the gardener in our context? Well, government is a huge part of the gardener, but not the only part. I would say media, foundations, corporations, communities, to the extent they have self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is allied with one group. I painted her red, that's why she prefers red over pink. And it's also dangerous when she's not concerned with equity. When she can look at her flower boxes and think that her garden is beautiful, thank you, because she's not even counting the pink flowers as part of her garden. And so our challenge is, what do we do about the gardener? Do we make the gardener striped or polka dotted or fuchsia? Do the pink flowers have to grow or recruit their own gardener? There are many, many questions that can come out of this story. And I know I'm hoping that you'll have some. I just want to share two quick questions that I always share now since I heard them the first time. The first one is, when I was asked, excuse me, Dr. Jones, why should the red flowers share their soil? When I heard that question, I loved that question because it told me, it showed me the power of this story to start conversations about racism that might be otherwise difficult if we're talking about racism between you and me. My answer to that question, why should the red flowers share their soil, is that actually that soil doesn't belong to the red flowers. It belongs to the whole garden. The second question I'd like to share with you is, what if that's not the original gardener that we're looking at right now? What if that's the gardener's great-great-great-great-grandchild? Here we are. And the great-great-great-great-grandchild has always seen the flowers looking like this, the boxes looking like this, may not even think that there's a problem to be solved. So very quickly, three things. We must make the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers a problem requiring urgent solution. We have to put it on the agenda. Then, in order to solve it, we must make those flower boxes transparent. We must be talking about the differences in the quality of the soil. And the third part of the answer is, as we make those flower boxes transparent, we must be clear that everybody understands that the pink seed did not just launch themselves into that poor rocky soil. So we must talk about history, and we must talk about the gardener's role in all of this. The gardener's agency in setting up the whole situation, how her initial preference for red over pink set up the whole situation, where that initial preference is what some people describe as cultural racism, and what in our current situation today is white supremacist ideology. Because if we do not talk about that, even if we were to compel that red gardener today to enrich the poor rocky soil until it was as rich as the rich fertile soil today, if she continues to prefer red over pink, she will continue to privilege red over pink going forward. So when I defined racism as a system of doing two things, of structuring opportunity and assigning value, for the longest time I told this story and it was all about the soil and the flower boxes. But I have come to recognize that we must pay attention both to the opportunity structure part of it and the value assignment part of it if we want to make things right in this garden. So very quickly, in my last 8 minutes, I want to just say that I recognize that the definition I gave you all of racism can be generalized to be a definition of any system of structured inequity. So for example, what is sexism? That's a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on gender that unfairly disadvantages some, unfairly advantages others, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And I recognize that there are many axes of inequity operating in our society today, intersecting in communities and in individuals, and that all of these axes of inequity are at least risk markers for how opportunity is structured and value is assigned, even as a smaller subset are actually risk factors in the progression to disease. And so then you might be surprised, well, Dr. Jones, you've been talking all this time about racism. Why have you focused your work and your whole life's career to issues of race as the axis of inequity and racism as the system of structured inequity when you recognize all this other stuff is going on? And my answer is that yes, I recognize that all of this is going on and we need to address these things. But racism, I focus on race and racism because racism is foundational in our nation's history, and yet many people are in denial of its continued existence and profoundly negative impacts on the health and well-being of the nation. So I strongly believe that all of us need to at least become actively anti-racist, even as we engage in these other struggles. And to the extent that we're able to dismantle the mechanisms of racism, the other struggles will benefit as well. So to that end, when I was president of the American Public Health Association in 2016, 4 years ago, I set our association and as many other organizations and communities as would join us on a national campaign against racism with 3 tasks: to name racism. I've given you lots of tools for that. Then to go beyond that to action. First to ask, how is racism operating here in my child's school, in my workplace, whatever, and then to organize and strategize to act once you've identified the levers for intervention, the targets for action. So this question, how is racism operating here, is a legitimate question because racism, as I have said, is not a cloud or a miasma that we can't get a handle on. It is a system with identifiable and addressable mechanisms in our structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, where each of those things are elements of decision-making. Structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, especially who's at the table and who's not, and what's on the agenda and what's not. And if structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, policies are the written how of decision-making, practices and norms are the unwritten how of decision-making, and values are the why. And so I just try to show you the usefulness of this question to identify levers, potential levers for intervention. I just did a thought experiment, and it's my own tiny little thought experiment. And I know that you guys will be able to take this grist for the mill, and if you choose to go deeply on each of these things. But I said, how is limited exposure of children of color to nature in the United States, how is racism operating in that? So with regard to structures, the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, well, actually racial segregation of our neighborhoods, right? With differential physical access to green space, differences in parental leisure time because of, the residential segregation by race has led to educational segregation and occupational segregation and people trying to work 2 and 3 jobs and the like. So I'm sure you could go deeper there in terms of structures, but just the placements. Well, and the policies that result in the placements of differential zoning policies, even in terms of, as I say, bus transfer stations and the like, but differential placement of environmental hazards, these things which make it even unhealthy to go outside, and organizational partnership decisions. And even for the organizations that are represented in this network, who are your partners, and how are you thinking about that? In terms of practices, so school recess policies or school actual connections to nature resources? And are the playgrounds parks and, with green space, or are they concrete? Support of scouting groups, the exposures to camping, and so the practices of schools, the practices in communities, the practices even of your organizations in promoting those things. Norms, so the staunch racism denial that is still the positioning of many people in this country, which would say that racism has nothing to do with any of this. And I hope that I've saved enough time to talk about the things that factor into that result in our staunch racism denial. And then on the part of people of color, safety concerns about venturing into unfamiliar settings. And do you really want to be walking through those woods by yourself or with your family? Do you feel safe? Oh, these days, absolutely not. So then we have to figure out, how do we increase the real safety as well as the perceptions of safety? There are two things to be done there. And then lost connection to the land. First, with the great migration of many people of African descent to the north, with the forced migration of many indigenous people, the lost connection to the land, which is being reinforced by structures to this day. And then the values are limited view. Some people who have a limited view of the full humanity of all of us. So some people say, well, those people just aren't interested in the outdoors. Or those people, they're not curious. They're not even scientific. They're not asking questions. I really appreciated Kim's opening story about how she looked at those ants dismembering her cookie, right? And that, but people say, well, those people aren't even able to be curious about the outdoors or be a scientist. And that say, those people aren't even interested in saving the planet. They have other interests. Well, I think all of us are interested in saving the planet and the like. So values that limit the view some of us have about the rest of us or all of us. Very quickly, I just want to say that I have a 3-part definition of health equity that I'm just going to skip over quickly to say the first part is, what is health equity? And I define it as assurance of the conditions for optimal health for all people, recognizing that health equity is a process. Assurance of what? Of the social determinants of health, the conditions for optimal health, for whom? For all people. How do we get there? The most important part of the definition. Achieving health equity requires at least these 3 things: valuing all individuals and populations equally, recognizing and rectifying historical injustices, and providing resources not equally, but according to need. And then how is health equity related to health disparities? Well, health disparities will be eliminated when health equity is achieved. Disparities is about counting, looking at differences in outcomes, looking at the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers, or just counting the numbers of different populations with exposure to the outdoors. Health equity is all the other stuff before, the assurance of the conditions to enable the optimal health and nature exposure outcomes for all people. There are 7, what I used to describe as societal or cultural barriers to achieving health equity. I now recognize these as the values targets for anti-racism action. The first is our narrow focus on the individual, which makes systems and structures either invisible or seemingly irrelevant. And there are other things too, but I will just talk very quickly into the points on this slide. The second is that we as a nation are ahistorical. We act as if the present were disconnected from the past, and as if the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage were just a happenstance. The third is our endorsement of the myth of meritocracy, this story that goes, if you work hard, you will make it. Now, I give you that most people who have made it have worked hard, although not everybody who's made it has worked hard, and we have big examples of that. But even as I recognize that most people who have made it have worked hard, there are many, many other people working just as hard or harder who will never make it because of an uneven playing field, which has been structured and is being maintained by racism, sexism, heterosexism, all of these systems of structured inequity. And to the extent that we deny those systems, then we are endorsing the myth of meritocracy, and we are blaming those people for being lazy or stupid or ignorant or whatever it is, for their failings, right? And we can deny racism many ways. One way is to say, I don't think racism exists, and many people are kind of saying that right now. But another way is to never say the word racism. Even if you're talking about disparities or disproportionalities or diversity, equity, inclusion, or structural structural competence or cultural competence or race, if you say all of those things without saying the word racism, getting the ism out of your mouth, which is the system part, if you are not saying the word racism in the context of widespread denial, then you are complicit with that denial. The fourth of these 7 barriers is the myth of the zero-sum game. If you gain, I lose, which sets us up in competition. And it's almost as if I'm sitting at a potluck dinner and I don't want you to come because I think you're just going to eat all the food, and I don't even recognize that you're bringing all kinds of cakes and pies and salads and fruits with you, right? Because I don't even value you. The fifth is our limited future orientation, which manifests, well, the 2 ways that we can touch the future right now, and you guys are at the intersection of this. The 2 ways that any of us can touch the future right now is by touching the children and by touching the planet. And in this country, we have disregard for the children and a usurious relationship with the planet. We do not, for example, have a 7 generations hence view in our decision-making that many American Indian nations have. And we do not have a how are the children focus like Maasai people. When they greet one another, they don't say, hey, how you doing? They ask the question, I am told, how are the children? And the answer they hope to get back is all the children are well. We don't even ask, how are the children? And if we did, we would not get the answer that all the children are well. And you all in your work, and we have this usurious relationship with the planet, as I said, in your work, you are at the intersection of this. You are about future. The 6th of these 7 things is the myth of American exceptionalism, that we in the United States, we even call American, and we're United Statesians, right? But we take America for, all of the North, Central, and South, right? But that we are so special, that we are so ordained by God that the usual rules don't apply to us, and that there's nothing we can learn from others. Oh, if we had only been learning, or still could learn, from how other people are dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And the 7th of these barriers is actually the first, white supremacist ideology. And when I put those words together, I'm not trying to have a lightning rod type of statement. What I am describing is a real idea, a false idea, the false idea that there is a gradation of human valuation by race, with white people at the top as the ideal or the norm. But this false idea of a hierarchy of human valuation by so-called race has given people who are living as white a sense of entitlement. It has resulted in the dehumanization of people of color, and at the fear, at the browning of America that's underlying a lot of our politics today. So I'm going to close by going back to my key messages, where I said the 4 key messages are that racism exists. I hope that you can use that open-closed dual reality restaurant saga to talk about that racism is a system, and that racism saps the strength of the whole society. That's encapsulated in my little 1-sentence definition. And the last thing, that we can act to dismantle racism. I've given you some ideas. I've given you maybe some inspiration, but what can we do today? Going back to that restaurant, we need to actively look for evidence of 2-sided signs. Is there something differential going on here by race, by language, by immigration status, by zip code, by gender, by whatever? We cannot be complacent with saying, oh, it looks open to me. Not so. We have to understand the existence of 2-sided signs and actively look for evidence of them. We need to burst through our bubbles of experience to experience our common humanity on different sides of town. All of us lives in a bubble of experience with our families and our work and the like. And most of us do not know that just across town, there are people who are just as kind, funny, generous, hardworking, smart as we are, who are living in very different circumstances. We need to burst through our bubbles to understand our common humanity in different circumstances. We need to be interested in the stories of others, and then believe the stories of others, and then join in the stories of others. I'm so heartened that many people are doing that with regard to the Black Lives Matter movement right now. But as I say, racism denial is so seductive in our country that we have to be acting. If we just say a thing, we're likely to forget why we said it in 6 months. We need to develop a sensitivity to seeing the absence of who is not at the table, what is not on the agenda, what policies are not in place or partnerships are not in place that if put in place could be quite useful. And we need to reveal inaction in the face of need, because that is the way that structural racism most often manifest these days. The most profound impacts of racism are not occurring through bias. They are occurring because structural racism, which requires no identifiable perpetrator, right, is just perpetuating itself and acting through lack of action in the face of need. But all of the work and all of the opportunity is not just on the part of those inside the restaurant, those on the outside. We need to know our power. We need to recognize that action is power, and especially that collective action is power. So I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to share some of my ideas with you, and I look forward to our discussion.